My world was a man's world. A woman's life was not pleasant in my day because, you see, a woman was the property of her man. If she was lucky enough to receive an inheritance from her father, that too became the property of her husband, and she had no right to it and no right to pass it on to her children. If she became a widow, as I did at age 32 with 4 children, ages 1 to 14, there was no hope of leading a decent life or of raising your children without the help of others. Even in death, my tombstone says, "and wife." And wife? Didn't I deserve my own eternal mention? My name is Betsey Ward Van Dusen, and buried here are my 2 husbands, William Van Dusen and Col Zenas Van Dusen, brothers. I was born in 1817 in the state of Vermont, and I married William when I was only 17 years old. My father thought he had good prospects and that it was time for me to leave the nest. So we set up housekeeping here in Glens Falls, and soon after, we were blessed with our first child, our son, Halsey. Since William's brother Zenas and his parents lived with us, we had a very large, complicated household that I was responsible for. And so I had no time for needlepoint or other fine crafts. Until, that is, I put my foot down and we hired a live-in girl to help. Sadly, William was stricken and died at age 34, leaving me a widow with 4 children and no money. You see, in our day, a widow could not inherit. Zenas and William had become very successful, but when William died, all of the things that William had accumulated in his young life were held in joint ownership with Zenas, including me. Zenas was a driven man. He never sat still, never took time off. He went to elementary school over in Queensbury, but his parents saw that he strove for bigger things, so they sent him to the Glens Falls Academy, and he flourished as a young man and learned the lumber business. Then, in 1842, Zenas and William purchased the land that was going to become the feeder dam. 55,000 acres on the Hudson River, the largest landholding in all of Glens Falls. And then they sued the state of New York and won the right of water use to build a sawmill. Zenas was troubled by his brother's death. I think that he felt it was his duty to rescue me and my children from what would have been certain ruin. So, in 1850, Zenas and I were married. And a few years later, our son, Zenas Jr., was born. Zenas not only raised and educated all of William's children, but he brought them into the business if they were so inclined. Now, in 1854, Zenas realized that he needed another kind of partner at the feeder dam. So he joined with J.W. Freeman and his son George, and by 1871, the feeder dam sawmill employed 100 men at 156 saws, cutting 10 million feet of lumber annually. And they operated 7 boats on the canals, taking that lumber to all of the far-flung parts of the Northeast where cities were burgeoning. By 1874, Col Zenas Van Dusen, as he was known then, was already experimenting with generating electricity at the sawmill, and his properties and businesses were worth $250,000. As you can imagine, my life was much easier. We lived in a large, lovely house with my son Nelson and his wife Mary, and Zenas Jr. and our friends Alice and William Stewart. How, you might ask, did Zenas acquire the title Colonel? Well, in our day, if you owned 55,000 acres of land and you contributed to the community, it was our custom to give a person a title. And since Zenas contributed to the local militia, he became Colonel Van Dusen. And that was a title he liked very much. Sadly, I did not live to see the Colonel's downfall, for I was laid to rest here in 1881 at age 63. A few years after that, Zenas suffered a terrible financial setback that almost wiped out his entire fortune, and what was left was purchased by George Freeman, who then turned the company around and became richer than ever. Meanwhile, Zenas, old and broken, died 2 years later at age 82. His passing was noted with an obituary in the New York Herald. And our son Zenas Jr. worked for 25 years as a foreman at the operation that should have been his, before he too was laid to rest here in 1912 at age 53. The stresses of life were different in our time. Women suffered as the property of men, and men were engaged in a tense struggle for success. When faced with failure, many men chose to take their own lives. Now, 100 years after the death of my son, I often wonder, was it all worth it? But as the good book says, consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance. Easier said than done. Thank you for coming and for listening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.